Whether intellectual property is a topic that needs a rebrand is something I wrote about in my blog last week, and it's something I want to briefly discuss in this video. There are lots of reasons I think IP has an image problem. For example, a marketer friend once advised me to remove intellectual property from the title of something I was creating because he thought the topic is boring for people. This really shocked me at the time and made quite an impression. So recently, when I was choosing the title of my new book, I tried hard to avoid mentioning intellectual property in the title. My publisher actually encouraged me to change the title that I had initially proposed to the current one, Brand Tuned, the New Rules of Branding, Strategy and Intellectual Property. Given that I'm an IP lawyer and that IP is one of the key benefits of the book, that is to explain how intellectual property is entwined with branding, I saw her point. The words had to appear in the title. I do realise, though, that the subject either doesn't mean anything to many people or is perceived as boring or largely irrelevant. I've been trying to analyse where these notions come from. You see, I think there is an assumption that IP is confusing, technical, expensive, and so on. Some people assume it's this esoteric body of law that operates in its own sphere and whose practitioners rarely travel outside their own little IP bubble. In fact, it's just the opposite. More than any other area of law, intellectual property bleeds into other areas of law. You see, IP issues pop up all the time, especially in the 21st century digital world that we now live in. After all, IP is intrinsic to business. It is actually part and parcel of it, not something separate from it. Also, IP surrounds some of the most important aspects of our daily lives. Is it worth investing in IP? This is another thing people wonder about, whether it would be worthwhile to invest time or money in IP, particularly in the early stages of their business. They may believe it's something relevant later, such as when they're close to selling the business, but they assume there are more fundamental priorities to address in the meantime. This notion that you wouldn't want to give much thought to IP in the early stages instead of later may be why its relevance to branding and starting up of a business is often missed. People invest large sums of money in branding without understanding the interplay between IP and brand. They're creating IP when they develop their brand. IP is intrinsic to what they're doing. Its creation, as well as its protection, determines whether you can stand out in the market and maintain your distinctiveness. While there must be a myriad number of reasons why IP has the perception it currently has, a more accurate view of IP needs to emerge. For a business considering its brand and IP, it's important to understand that IP sits at the intersection between marketing, business, and branding. The areas of IP that are most relevant to brands are trademarks, copyright, and designs, but maybe identifying the IP rights by name instead of discussing the contexts in which IP is relevant is the wrong approach. One reason why I'm writing my new book is to make it clearer to marketers, designers, and businesses just how IP impacts branding. Building your brand on solid foundations involves taking account of IP risks and opportunities very early on, so you avoid the need to undo ill-considered actions later. Leaving IP till you're ready to sell your business is completely the wrong approach, but perhaps that is a subject for another day. What do you think? What's your view about IP's relevance in business and branding? I'd love to know.